Welcome to BFR Radio, a podcast dedicated to all things BFR. This podcast is proudly sponsored by sportsrehab.com.au, where if you want to buy your own BFR cuffs, or you want more information about the type of training, or you just want more information, this is your one place to go. And I'm your host, Chris Gavilio. Hi everyone, and welcome back to BFR Radio. I truly hope you've been enjoying this podcast format. If you've been following me on Instagram, you would have noticed I just finished 2 weeks of a high-frequency BFR bench press block. This training block was actually inspired by a paper I read from Yasuda, where they studied the effects of low-intensity bench press training with BFR on chest muscle hypertrophy. Therefore, what I thought I'd do in this podcast is review this paper, but take the opportunity to actually use my scenario as a comparison at the same time, and talk about the difference between the two groups as something for you to consider if you want to try implement this into your own training program. In the study, they used 10 young men aged between 23 to 38 years. I'm just a couple of years older than that. Their height on average was 172 centimeters and a body weight of 66 kilos. Myself, I'm 185 centimeters tall on a good day, and my body weight's 105.5 kilos. Their bench press 1RM on average was 58 kilos with a maximum of 66 kilos, whereas my 1RM, although a little old, is 194 kilos. I'd actually just come off a period of French contrast work where I was able to actually get a lot of data on isometric bench press and velocity data at submaximal loads. Further to this, I actually had the submaximal velocity data when I lifted my 194 kilos as a really good comparison, as they actually correlated spot on to my 1RM during that lift. The training history in the study was approximately 1 year, whereas I'd probably been lifting for about 20 years or so. Looking at their bench press 1RM, the loads used in the study at 30% was 17.4 kilos. Whereas my load at 30% based upon a conservative 180 kilo bench press was 60 kilos. So the load I was using in my study block was just the same as their maximum 1RM. The protocol that they used in the study was bench press, 4 sets of 75 reps, where the first set was 30 reps, followed by 3 sets of 15. My protocol adapted slightly. With the cuffs on, I performed a warm-up with activation and rehab-based shoulder exercises, and then I supersetted the bench press with some back exercises at 4 sets of 12. The pressure in the Yasuda study, they started at 100 mils of mercury and increased 10 mils every day until they reached 160 millimeters of mercury. The cuff width in the Yasuda study was not stated, and it also said it was an elastic cuff. My mind actually then says, well, if it's an elastic cuff and they're actually pumping up to a known pressure, when they're moving, does that actually change? In comparison, my pressure was set at 160 millimeters of mercury and my cuff width was 6.5 centimeters. At this stage, the study looks pretty straightforward. Twice a day bench pressing for 2 weeks, 1 day off in the middle of it. The testing they used was a 1RM bench press, muscle cross-sectional area using MRI, so really good imaging. And they also took some blood markers of performance, so anabolic type hormones such as IGF-1, growth hormone, and also markers of muscle damage such as phosphocreatine and myoglobin. In my case, I used my French contrast data with the isometric bench and also the velocity data that I had, and I also had skin folds and girths taken as a measurement for any sort of muscle hypertrophy. Also must realize I've been training for about 20 years, and I know in the last 5 to 6 years, I really haven't changed in size. Probably haven't eaten or trained any harder to elicit this type of change. So I was really excited if I was to add a lighter stimulus such as 30% bench pressing, that I would possibly try and get some sort of gains. The only modification I did to this protocol was that I included 2 heavier bench press sessions in the week. I'm a big believer that in well-trained athletes, you actually need to lift some load. I kept the cuffs on. I still kept the load possibly submaximal. For example, in these sessions, on one day I did bench press with the cuffs on. I would do a double up to 140. And on the other day I used a Swiss bar and I would do 5s on 100 to 110 kilos. The load was obviously higher than a 30% 1RM, however, still not close to my 1RM. Now to the really interesting part of it, the results. In the Yasuda study, on average, triceps increased 8% and chest 16%. Whereas in the control group, they had no change. Myself, my biceps relaxed, improved by 0.7 of a centimeter, so 1.7%, and a flex position, 0.8 of a centimeter at 41.4 centimeters, improved 1.9%. My chest improved 3.6 centimeters or 3.2%. As I said earlier, my body really hasn't changed much in the last few years. So I was happy with small increments in this type of measurement, and I didn't really expect much to improve in my arms because I didn't include any specific bicep or arm work in this training block. In the study, they showed no changes in anabolic hormones of growth hormone, IGF-1, nor testosterone for pre to post. However, it must be important to note here they didn't take acute markers, and this would have been really interesting to see the difference between the control group who didn't use BFR and the BFR group if acute training did improve these really good anabolic hormones, as this would have potentially highlighted the changes that they saw in the study. There was no changes in the resting blood markers for muscle damage, phosphocreatine and myoglobin, and historically other papers also backed this up. Now to the really interesting information, did it improve strength? The study showed that the bench press 1RM improved 6% in the BFR group and actually went backwards in the control. With respect to my own data, my submaximal data really improved out of sight. With respect to a load of 100 kilos, my best data over the last 18 months was 0.89 meters per second, and that improved to 0.97 meters per second, which is a 9% improvement in performance. With respect to when I benched 194 kilos, from 80 to 140 kilos, all my average velocity data improved out of sight. However, my isometric bench press actually went down a little bit. Prior to this was 1,860 newtons and actually decreased 9.7% to 1,764 newtons. For me, this just really indicates that I needed to be lifting heavier during this training block. I think this is just a reflection of my training age and also my 1RM, and also sits well with other suggestions that there's no substitute for lifting heavy. If you need to be improving 1RM bench press strength and you've got a really well-trained, strong athlete, that's what you need to be touching on. The BFR, it's a really good addition to your training and can help get little gains such as small improvements in muscle girth, and in my case, small improvements in my submaximal velocity data. And that also comes down to when we're training athletes, what are we really trying to achieve with this? Are we trying to improve our absolute 1RM? Or is it rather submaximal loads where we can move the bar faster that have greater application to our sport? So that's really important to consider. However, in a relatively untrained population, if you want to get a quick gain in strength, that this potentially could be something that you could consider. My thoughts on this type of training is that, to be honest, it was pretty tiring. I was adding a lot of extra load onto my own typical training, and this perhaps made my body tired. As I stated briefly earlier, the differences seen in results could also potentially be the difference between someone with a low and a high training age. And remembering that although I did add 2 heavier lifts in during the week, the maximum load there was only 140 kilos with BFR. I potentially needed to be lifting closer to my 1RM, so around 90%, and also potentially doing some partial range work where I'm actually getting exposed to loads higher. And I do know when I lifted the 194 kilos that I actually did do some 105, 110% work with eccentrics and board work to get used to the heavy loads. If I had my time again, the heavy load days would be without the BFR and ensure that I achieve heavier loads greater than what I did in my previous session. And also with athletes with a greater training age, possibly you don't need to do double bench press days. So you could potentially incorporate a mixture of double days, and on your big, heavier bench press day, just do one session perhaps. And as I've highlighted in other podcasts, it's really important when you read a paper that you really decipher between the subjects being used, the protocols being used, and does that actually apply to your own group that you're training with. Be willing to experiment a little bit with the protocols is really important to make this type of training work for you. I hope you've enjoyed that. It was really quite fun for myself to do this study and use it as a comparison when I've reviewed a paper for the podcast. I'm actually looking at repeating this type of training again, however, periodizing it slightly differently to include higher load lifting days and actually be a little bit more selective on the days that I do BFR and don't do BFR. Therefore, if you're really interested in hearing about these results, let me know and I'll make sure I put this into a podcast format. Anyway, it's now on to how you do BFR. So today on How You Do BFR, I've got strength and conditioning coach from the Queensland Academy of Sport, Jordan Desbrow. Welcome aboard.
Thanks, Chris. It's good to be on the show.
Jordan and I work together at the Queensland Academy of Sport, both as strength and conditioning coaches, as I just said. And I want to bring Jordan on today to tell his story about his experience with BFR. I'll get Jordan to give a little bit of background about leading up to before we used BFR, and then how I came in suggesting how we could potentially use it to help his shoulder. Jordan, if you just give a bit of background to the listeners.
Yep. Basically, I was a pretty keen gridiron player when I was younger, coming through uni, and I played it for about 3 years. And while playing, I sustained 4 or so dislocations of my right shoulder. And then I basically had a bit of time off. I didn't play for, say, 2 years. And then my shoulder had gone to the point where it was starting to dislocate in my sleep. So it was at that point I saw a surgeon, and it was recommended that I get my shoulder reconstruction done to repair my capsule and my labrum.
And at that point at work, we knew that you had issues with your shoulder.
Yeah.
Then we spoke about doing a pre-operative strengthening program and potentially using BFR, because you also had issues with pain as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. So my shoulder, depending on the day or what I was doing in the gym, it'd give me a little bit of grief, just kind of discomfort-wise, like sometimes with a bench press, with a barbell, or with an overhead press. I wanted to be able to train pain and discomfort-free leading up to my operation and get it as strong as possible. So I think with the BFR, when I started here, I saw you using it on your legs a fair bit, and I was just interested generally about how it was used and what sort of methods we could use with it. So it was at that point when I sort of decided I was going to do a bit of a case study on myself for sort of pre-operative strengthening of my shoulder. We had a bit of a chat on how can we incorporate BFR, so the upper body cuffs which go on your bicep, how can we incorporate those to build or increase my sort of strength and attenuate any muscle loss leading into surgery?
We looked at research that's actually out there already. If you pre-strengthen the musculature around a joint or around an area prior to an operation, the recovery rate is a lot better and the success rate of the operation is a lot better. And then also there's a lot of evidence around using it post-operatively, passively, to attenuate the muscle loss. And also, as Jordan said, he had a lot of pain in the joint and discomfort, and there's actually been some evidence around decreasing joint and also tendon pain. Therefore, putting all these things together that we read in literature, trying to make a really nice case study as well. Did you want to just explain what the program looked like?
Yeah, sure. So leading into surgery, I had a sort of an 8-week period when I first decided I was going to do this. And it was at the start of that 8 weeks that I got isometric dynamometer strength levels for my shoulder assessed. So for internal rotation and external rotation at 0 degrees and 90 degrees of shoulder abduction. Got those done just as my sort of measures. And then from there, I constructed a prehabilitation program for my shoulder, which just included some external rotation and internal rotation with a TheraBand at 0 degrees and at 90 degrees. There was an ATY series, which I did, which was 10 to 12 repetitions of each position of shoulder extension in each position of the A, T, and Y. So all for my posterior cuff, posterior deltoid strength. And then the last exercise which I had in there was a lateral dumbbell raise. All the exercises were basically focused around improving shoulder strength and shoulder function, particularly of that glenohumeral joint. And then at the end of that 8 weeks, I retested my isometric dynamometer scores for external and internal rotation at the 2 positions, both left to right.
So let's start with, what was your initial testing results for your internal, external?
Yep. On my good side, at 0 degrees for external rotation, I scored 146 newtons. On my injured side, so my right, it was 133. There was a 9% decrement in external rotation strength, left to right or injured to uninjured. At 90 degrees, my external rotation on my left, uninjured side, was 169. And then on my injured side, so the right, it was 91, which was basically a 46% decrement in strength from the uninjured to the injured side.
That's massive.
Yeah. And even just subjectively doing that test, I didn't feel super confident with my arm in that position. So we measured it laying on my back with my arm out to my side at 90 degrees. And just that position felt weak. And I was pretty apprehensive, to be honest.
From this information, you also were able to create internal to external rotation ratios. There's some literature out there on different ratios and so forth. Did that match up with anything that's currently in literature?
Yeah, it did. There was a few studies that had talked about the ratio of external rotation to internal rotation. One particularly talking about that 70 to 80% mark. My measures were around 0.65 for my injured side, which is below the ratio that the literature recommends to stay injury-free.
That's right. You've already got an injured shoulder,
Yeah.
and it's showing you that these ratios are created for someone that could be predisposed to injuries, but it's already injured, so we know that. However, it has a baseline for you to guide yourself, I guess, from that next point when you post-operative, when you're going to return back to sport or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, correct.
Now, there was something else which I found really quite interesting, which I initially was a bit cautious on. You also wanted to do some 1RM testing as well.
Yeah. So being a strength coach, I didn't just want to have the isometric dynamometer measures as my only measure in my sort of case study. I wanted some level of, or some measure of upper body strength, both push and pull. I remember the first time I brought this up with Chris, I said that I wanted to do a 1RM bench press and a 1RM chin-up, which I hadn't done for 3 years or 4 years pre my injuries. And at the time, he was a bit tentative and sort of said, I don't know, just see how you feel. You might end up doing a 5RM or something like that. We kept that in the back of our heads through the case study, and it ended up getting to the 8 weeks, and I felt pretty good with my shoulder and with where the strength level was at. So I did decide to do the 1RM bench press and the 1RM chin-up.
And before you get to that, I think also tell the listeners, this was really cool, because I remember your first few sessions didn't feel great, but talk about just your range of movement, especially in your chin-up, because you're doing full range chin-ups as well.
Yeah, so I did the chin-ups at neutral grip, full range. The start of my 8 weeks was probably about 2 months post my shoulder dislocating in my sleep. So I was 2 months post my last dislocation episode, but when I started this, so my chin-ups were a bit shaky. I wasn't sort of confident to go to a full hang position. And I was just working through probably an 80% limited range. By the end of the 8 weeks, I was quite confident going to the full hang position, and I was doing sets of 8 body weight comfortably at that position. So it felt pretty good and felt strong. That
was amazing. And what was the other word that you used? Well, you used
confidence.
Confidence and supportive. And I think a lot of people sort of say that when they use the cuff on knee joints and shoulders, is that the joint just feels supportive and the musculature feels active, like it can support the joint.
Yeah, the bench press was another one. Just the difference between barbell bench pressing with the cuffs and without the cuffs. I felt, whether it was in my head, I felt stronger and I felt less apprehensive going to that position right at the bottom where the bar was on my chest. I could do full range pressing when I had the cuffs on versus sort of at the start when I wasn't using them.
Sure. And then, so you had your 8 weeks, you did your prehab. How often did you do that? And then your strength stuff was quite simple, wasn't it?
The routine that I followed was I did my prehab program 3 times a week. And those 3 days were usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I did an upper body strength session twice a week. The days on which I did that rotated throughout the 8 weeks. Normally my prehab program preceded the strength session on, say, a Monday and a Wednesday, and then it was on a standalone session on the Friday by itself, where I might have done a lower body strength session. So basically it was the pre-rehabilitation program 3 times a week, and then the strength program twice a week.
Those strength sessions, what did that consist of?
So my program for that was 6 or so exercises. I went through a barbell bench press, anywhere between 5 to 6 rep sets and 4 sets. A chin-up, the neutral grip, say 4 sets of 5, and then I progressed from body weight to say 2.5 kilos between my legs, hanging by a chain towards the end of it. I did a superset of incline dumbbell press and seated row, 3 sets of 8, and then normally finished with some sort of hypertrophy, a superset where it might have been front dumbbell raises and a TRX row, and they were normally 3 sets of 10 to 12.
So supersetting quite nicely, balancing between pushes and pulls, getting a little bit of shoulder work in there as well.
Yeah.
And also important to note that although it was 4 sets of 6, it was within a good technical loading.
So my 4 sets of 6 might have been 75% 1RM for my bench press. Some of the sets of 8 might have been at a 10 RM weight range, where usually I had 1 to 2 reps left in the tank.
And a lot of studies out there actually have a high frequency type training, periodization twice a day for 6 days a week. This is a more realistic model. 3 times a week.
Yeah.
Do your prehab before your main strength session, only 2 of them. Let's get on to the results.
Yeah, so if we start with my isometric dynamometer stuff, the external rotation on my injured side improved from, and this is at 0 degrees. My external rotation at 0 degrees on my injured side went from 133 to 171, which is basically a 29% increase in isometric strength on that side.
Fantastic.
And that was at 0 degrees. At 90 degrees.
So 90 degrees to the shoulder?
Yeah, 90 degrees shoulder abduction. I improved from 91 newtons pre to 189 post. That's 108%.
Wow,
increase.
doubled.
Yeah. And even like I was saying before, the post measure for that, I felt much stronger in that position and much more confident in actually completing the test.
Fantastic.
So that was my big improvement there. In terms of my ratios, we were talking about that sort of 0.7, 0.8 mark is what the literature recommends for healthy, uninjured, and risk-free. At 0 degrees on my injured side, my external to internal rotation ratio went from 0.65 to 0.74, starting to push into that range that the literature recommends. And then at 90 degrees, pre the intervention, it was 0.72, and then post, I got it up to 1.08. So that massive increase in external rotation, strength and function got me just above the 1-to-1 ratio.
And you also had improvements in your good side as well.
Yeah, yep.
And that's also obviously important to note. But what's here, we've got a compromised joint, compromised function, where there's lots of pain. He's actually now able to get more into that, what we call a safer ratio zone, and he's actually feeling more confident. And for all the muscle heads out there who care all about bench pressing, what actually happened there?
Yeah, so I didn't have any pre-strength measures, obviously, just because my shoulder was at risk at the start of my intervention. By the end of it, so on the day of testing, which was a day before my surgery, I hit a 1RM bench of 92.5 and a 1RM chin-up of 22.5 plus body weight.
And what's your body weight?
82.
So you're benching over your body weight for bench press?
Yep. And my chin-up would have been about 1.2. So my chin-up was also above my bench press. So my pulling strength was above pushing as well.
And this is at full range. So you got to remember once again that you haven't got confidence in your shoulder initially.
Yeah.
In 8 weeks, you've gained confidence. You've got strength in this range. You've got confidence. You're able to do plus 22 kilo body weight. It's fantastic. Well done.
Yeah, I was super stoked with those results heading into surgery. Just with the amount of literature, not necessarily in shoulder reconstruction, but there's a ton of research in ACL that just states how much increased pre-operative strength and function leads to much better outcomes post-surgery, which is what I'm chasing.
Definitely. And you've now had the surgery. Where are you at with your surgery? What happened? So
I had my surgery. The surgeon said I'd done a pretty good job in there in terms of wrecking some of the structures. So I had 5 anchors put in my labrum and a capsule reconstruction. So I'm now 12 weeks post-op this week. I'll go back and see my surgeon and my physio tomorrow. But in terms of post-surgery, I've been using BFR passively since about the 3-week mark, both on my uninjured and repaired side. And then from about the 6-week post-surgery mark, I've been using BFR in conjunction with isometric internal and external rotation with a cable. And now that I've progressed to some band pulling and pressing work, I've been using it with that as well.
And the other thing that you've been doing is that you've been lifting normally single arm on your uninjured side to try and take advantage of that cross transfer of strength from uninjured to injured, where that neural pathway actually has been shown to help with some form of strength improvement.
Yeah. Another thing with it I have included in the post follow-up is getting arm circumference measures, so a measure of muscle mass around my bicep and tricep. So I've got that done at the pre-surgery mark, 6 weeks post-surgery, and then this week I'm about to do a 12-week follow-up. So that'll give us just another measure of how using BFR passively has helped attenuate and even build muscle in this post-operative period. That's
right. And the really cool thing here is Jordan's actually put this together as a paper for the ASCA, or the Australian Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association. So that's part of his level 2 accreditation. Hopefully that'll be published pretty soon. If you're part of the ACA, stay tuned, and I'm sure you get to read that. And also what we're going to do from here is keep following and hopefully do a write-up as a follow-up of how to actually improve your strength, or I guess accelerate your strength using minimal mechanical stress and taking advantage of the metabolic stress used within BFR.
Yeah.
Anything else in closing around the use of BFR in yourself for your shoulder, pre-operatively or even post-operatively?
One thing that was super easy, even when I was in the sling, I could just be sitting at my desk, I was still doing work and be doing the BFR passively on my arms. One of the troubles of having a shoulder operation is that someone else has to pump the cuffs up. Chris was my go-to for that for the first sort of 3 to 4 weeks. I was annoying him when he was in the gym and when we were in the office. But it's just really easy to get those little benefits that are going to make such a big difference post-surgery.
And I think if anyone wants to see the pictures of these exercises, please let us know in the comments, and I'll talk to Jordan. I'll get those photos and I'll put them up on the on the blog post as well, so you can actually get a better idea of what the exercises were. They're pretty simple, weren't they?
Yeah, it was all simple stuff. It was just a matter of consistency and making sure that I was doing it all correctly to get my shoulder healthy.
I think that's the exciting thing is, as I said earlier, is that a lot of BFR programs talk about this double day, 6 days a week. You just did a normal program, 3 days a week. You were consistent. There was no magic in the exercise. They were really the basic ones, but the best ones perhaps.
Yeah.
And if anyone wants to get a hold of you because you've got a really exciting story around this and they want to contact you directly.
Yep, so I'm on Twitter. My handle is @JordanDesbrow. So Desbrow is just DESBROW.
Well, thanks for your time, Jordan. Really appreciate it. It's a great story and really highlights how good this BFR could be for people, not only with lower limb and obviously with upper limb injuries. We're going to be following his story and do a follow-up in a couple of months' time just to see where he's at. And I hope you enjoy this. And if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments on the blog or in my own social media on Twitter or Instagram @Chris Cavilio. Thanks again, Jordan, for joining in.
No, thank you. I can't wait to show everyone the post-operative results to come.
Righto. And we'll talk to you soon.
Perfect.
Thanks.
See ya.
And that's all today for this episode of BFR Radio. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to take part in the podcast, please contact me through my website or on social media channels @Chris Cavilio. For more information and to order a set of your own BFR cuffs, please visit my website at sportsrehab.com.au. Thanks for listening and keep the pump.